Kia ora koutou. Welcome everybody to this next session of the Treaty-Based Futures and Anti-Racism, the 1 p.m., where we'll be talking about men, gender equity, and anti-racism, organizing and research perspectives. I'll just start with karakia. Whakataka te ho ki te uru, whakataka te ho ki te tonga, kia mā kine kine ke uta, kia mā tara tara ki tai. E hi aka ana te atakura, he tio, he huka, he hohu, tihe, welcome everybody, and just a quick reminder as we get started that all of our chats are being moderated, so please be kind to everyone. We have our community code up on the website and here in front of us. The big things are we're here for open and respectful communication. So we're curious, open, respectful. We make generous assumptions of our other conference attendees. We maintain confidentiality for the things discussed about one person, one mic, so only one person speaking at a time. We're speaking from our own experiences when we comment. No one knows everything, but together we know a lot. So we make space for each other, but we're also willing to take the space so that we can share our knowledge that we each have. And we can't be articulate all the time, which I will display frequently over the next couple minutes. And we don't take ourselves too seriously, which I will also display over the next couple minutes. And yeah, so as I mentioned, the chats will be moderated, and if we can direct all questions to the Q&A section, and the chats can stand alone in the chat section, if that makes sense. For those who want the live captions, the way to get to them is you go to www.caseviewnet.com. You add the session code in, which at the moment is 0YDHFF, enter the password, which is save_5F83. You enter your name, but don't worry about the organization or your email. You click connect, and that will bring up the live captions for this session. Right. And then, yeah, to start, I'll introduce myself and then I'll pass on to, I'm here as the moderator, and I'll pass on to the people who are actually here to share their knowledge. So I'm originally from Canada, which is why I speak from funny. I grew up on the Treaty 3 land of the Wabigoon Lake Ojibwe Nation people in northwestern Ontario, Canada. Whakapapa back to Romania, Germany, Italy, and England from my 4 grandfathers. My name's Mikey Brendorfer. I work as a nurse practitioner in youth health. I'm a member of the organizing committee for this conference and for STIR. And I frequently get asked to speak about positive masculinity, which I usually take as a humbling, quite a humbling offer, or whatever the other word is that I've forgotten. So I'm here as the chair for today's discussion, which means I'm not going to do much more talking, except to hurry things on from time to time. But I'll pass on to Matt, isn't it? Am I correct? Yeah, to Matt.
Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Ko waio, no Lubnana ho, ko Arazarab toko monga, ko Waidi Kadisha toko te awa, ko Fakhri toko iwi. Ke tamaki makaurau aho e noho ana, ke te whare wānanga o courageous conversations about race aho e mahi ana, toku wha aku tamariki, ko Jano tako hoa rangatira, ko Matthew Ferry tēnei, nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Well, welcome to all those out there who have joined our session, and it's such an honour to be here. We chose, as I've been engaging with Derek, he was learning a bit more about what we do. And I said the way we introduce ourselves, really just an extension of what I just did in my pepeha, was use place, name and intention. It's a significant move away from introductions of the business card, because if we're going to be different in healthcare and education, we have to find new ways of bringing ourselves into spaces, clearly in Aotearoa, inspired by Te Ao Māori. And so place, name and intention is the way I'm going to model that now, and then Derek, I'll hand over to Derek and we'll get going. So you may have understood some of my pepeha, but my connection to place, I'm going to give you 2 aspects to that. One is that my people arrived in Aotearoa 130 years ago from the Arab world, from Lebanon. And they arrived to Dunedin. They arrived into an already hostile, racist Aotearoa New Zealand. And even saying that, my ancestors weren't able to say I'm Arab, I'm Lebanese. They arrived into an already racially hostile New Zealand due to the original or the initial racial contradiction of the dispossession of tangata whenua from their land and resources and treasures. At the time, my great-grandfather and his community were referred to by the then Prime Minister, Richard John Seddon, as barbarous savages who would add no wealth to the country. So for most of my life, I've never said that immediately, but I say it right now to you that I'm an Arab and I'm proud to be one. The other connection, so I love Lebanon and I've just come back from 7 weeks there. My other connection to land, definitely, if I take it more specifically today, I sit on the lands of Te Kawerau Amaki. They're the iwi. I want to honour that, and I want to talk. I want to say that I realise I'm on stolen lands today, and then just to. My other connection is I also love New Zealand and Aotearoa, and my connection to this land really sits in my lifelong journey to explore and to live what it means to be tangata tiriti. And so that's my story of place. My naming story is interesting in the sense that I only have whakapapa or genealogy or ancestry back to one village in the north of Lebanon and one clan. And so how do you come up with a name like Matt Farry? Matthew is Hebrew English, Farry is English Irish. And so there is a story of race in that, right? Because I have another name and a name I'd like to also share with you. It's not my official name, but it's a name I'm known by in my community, my family, and in Lebanon, and it's Matafakri. So you now know more about me than any teacher ever knew about me, than any healthcare professional ever knew about me. And it's significant in the sense that it's hard to know who I am only knowing my name is Matthew Farry. So I also have a connection to this name, Matafakri. And the last part is intention. Well, my intention for the session is very, it's really funny how I even got here, because I was speaking to the wonderful Heather Kane about treaty-based futures and talking about how we would support them. And Heather, as she normally does, and I'm pretty sure you're out there, Heather, you're a bit of a matchmaker when it comes to this work. And so, oh, Derek, you'd go well with Derek. Why don't you support Derek? And I sort of put my hand up and said, oh, that sounds great. And then what I realized at that point, this is not really my topic, but I work in it. And I've learned so much off Derek, my brother right here. Yeah, it's been an amazing experience, actually. And so my intention is to continue learning and to continue challenging myself, because what's happened with my engagement with Derek's work is it's helped me work out who I am in this problem, much more than just defining the problem. And we're going to go there. So that's my intention, and to bring some of the courageous conversations tools to you, just to help you process or engage with this particular kaupapa. I'm going to hand over to Derek.
Yeah. Kia ora. It's a pleasure to be here with you. I'm currently sitting on the unceded lands of the Manahoac and Monacan people in Eastern Virginia. I'm the child of Jamaican and Guyanese immigrants to the United States, but I'm Black American. I was born here in the States. I'm a professor, professionally, I'm a professor at Georgetown. I co-direct the Racial Justice Institute, a university-wide entity that's focused on racial justice and equity. Direct the Center for Men's Health Equity and chair a group called Global Action on Men's Health, which is a global advocacy organization focusing on men in policy. My intention is really to try to have a conversation that will hopefully begin to link different movements that I don't see tend to be somewhat separate. And if you think about sort of the anti-racism movement, anti-racism as a movement, we think about gender equity and really trying to figure out how we're going to, particularly as men, support gender equity as a real concrete thing. but then also thinking about the issues of men's health and gender health equity, where men tend to do worse. And so how do we actually support one another in these conversations? So part of our title was really trying to reflect that and reflect the need to have some space to integrate these different conversations. And as part of that is really to challenge ourselves to be better, to be different, and to grow in that space. Let me give it back to Matt.
Kia ora, Derek. Thank you. So what we're going to do is I'm going to hand it pretty quickly back to Derek just to frame our conversation. But I want to introduce to you one of the tools that we use, because our role at Courageous Conversation, especially when it comes to organising inside organisations or our work with youth, is always around how do we have a more productive, generative, healthy conversation about race or gender equity, and health equity. And so what I want you to do is to use our compass just to hold some of the ideas, if it's of value to you. So I'll tell you how it was of value to me. If you just go to the next slide quickly, Anna. So the compass helps us build some relatability in the conversation, but most of you will be sitting by yourselves. So I'm not going to go to how that works, but really just as you listen to Derek's presentation, and I know that when I engage with Derek's work, first through meeting him and then reading some of it, some of the beliefs I've held were challenged and others were fortified. Derek's work has interrupted me a little bit, and I thank him for that. It's caused some discomfort, and really I know when my beliefs are being, some of my long-held beliefs, they're being challenged or fortified. It's a productive place for me to be in. It's also brought up some feelings for me, some emotions. As I sit with you today as a white presenting Arab in a white colonial settler nation, and thinking back on my life and my health, I've seen myself in different aspects of Derek's work, and that's brought up some feelings. Thinking and acting, we get into that a lot. Yeah, think, do, think, do. Strategy, policy change. Yeah, evaluate. But actually, what we're trying to do at Courageous Conversation is open this conversation up to a wider, have a greater conversation. We need great thinking and courageous acting, but we also need to be able to speak to that left-hand side of the compass. So as you become interrupted today, or not interrupted, try and process some of that by thinking, and we'll return to this after Derek's framed down. Let's return to the compass and see what's coming up for you. Is it a belief that you're struggling with? Is it a thought? Is it a reflection? Do you see yourself in some of this? Is it a feeling? And what sort of doing do you want to do following this? So handing back to Derek.
Yeah, thanks, man. So let me begin by just making sure that it's clear where my, again, positionality and sort of anchor is. As a men's health person, I'm not going to pretend like I know women's health. So I'm going to present this mostly from a men's health perspective, and how and why this is important to me to recognize how we're going to engage in these conversations. A lot of it is coming from my work in trying to advocate for men's health, and it feeling like to those I'm working with, whether it's at global organizations like the World Health Organization, regional offices of those, my own government, health institutes, and so forth, there's been an interesting response when I talk about men's health. And it often gets to, and we'll get to this in just a minute, the questions about, well, how do we explain why men have worse health? How do we are we going to be taking resources away from women's health to then promote men's health? And isn't that a natural part of what we're talking about? Next slide. And so my first point is, no, we don't have to necessarily, this is not a zero-sum game. I mean, I don't have to take something from women's health and sexual gender minority health to actually promote men's health. We actually have an example of how we looked at COVID through a gendered lens that actually looked at all three groups, and how COVID particularly differentially affected women, men, and those who don't fit that sex and gender binary. And so it was really important for us to think about that and to know going into this that we're not talking about taking resources away from anyone. We are talking about finding a way to actually have something that is more than the sum of its parts, where we're actually working together to advance everyone in this equity conversation. Next slide. So this is a real ad. And I start here often with the men's health side of things, because this is often how we think about and explain men's health. This ad was from a US government agency. This was some years ago now, and it was trying to promote preventive medical tests for men. So getting them to go to the doctor, getting them to go get screening, well-man visits, and so forth. Something that we know that women tend to do at far higher rates than men. The problem is with this is that it locates the problem of men's health only in men's heads. And while that is a scary place, no doubt, and sometimes an unhealthy place, it is not the only location of the problem of men's health and how we explain some of the issues related to masculinities and some of the other intersecting factors that go with that. And so we have to find a space where we can actually engage with those conversations and bring that into other spaces. Next slide. So I want to also anchor this in some data, which I will try to go relatively quickly through. The quick point of these slides is just to show you the general pattern. I'm not going to go through the weeds of these. But what I'm showing here is over approximately a 120-year period. Again, I'm going to talk mostly about US data just because, again, that's what I have most immediately available and accessible. And so this is sex differences in life expectancy in the United States, where historically what we've seen in this pattern is that women are tending to live longer than men. This is a global pattern. When you look at the patterns that you see from, again, data from the World Health Organization and so forth, particularly their reports on non-communicable diseases, you'll see these patterns reproducing. The part that I'm trying to highlight here is that these have not been static, and that there's something that has happened over this period where you've seen things go up and down, but it's generally been that the gap between men and women in terms of our life expectancy, males and females in our life expectancy, has actually grown over time. And so the point here is that these things are not just about male biology, and they can't be just within the individual men that have lived throughout these periods. There must be something else going on in our society, in our world that has happened that is somehow or another differentially affecting men and women. Again, it's not to say that we need to shut down doing whatever it was that has led to this, because this is a lot of things that could have happened in more than 120 years. But it is to say that we need to use a gendered lens that also is going to reflect on men and not just look at a gendered lens to be synonymous with women's health. Next slide. Just the other point, if you want more information, this idea that the sex difference and sex gap is something that has really been a 20th century phenomenon. So prior to the 20th century, there really was not a gender difference in life expectancy. And I'm using that because it is such a more robust measure of health than some of these other issues. But it is something that has grown over time, and it's largely grown because of cancer and cardiovascular disease. And as you see, with the male mortality rates from heart disease. So the point is, again, just to make sure we're clear, this is not something that we have to have. This is not something that is not modifiable. Much like racism, it's something that we actually can intervene on and address. Next slide. And this is just showing more that, so this is important because it's showing that out of the 15 leading causes of death for men and women in the United States, that 13 of the 15, well, basically the 15 leading causes are the same. Men are higher in 13 of the 15 of those. The two where women are higher are, what am I doing? Cerebrovascular disease, I believe. Sorry, I'm doing this backwards. I'm not, I'm doing the Mikey, what Mikey was saying, as smart as we sound sometimes, this is, I'm looking at this on my screen and trying to remember which exact two there are, but there are only two, trust me, where women do better than men, men are doing better than women, but it's basically overall, you see this overall pattern of, and we see these kind of connections. Next slide. Thank you. See, this is why we have a team approach here. So thank you, Anna. So what I'm also trying to show to complicate this story even further is to bring in the conversation not just about sex differences, but also talk about race. And so this is where we saw the connection between anti-racism, race, and so forth, and this conversation about gender and how we need to integrate these conversations more effectively. So again, while we've seen this sex difference actually grow over time, we've actually seen the racial differences that are really important in our country actually shrink in some ways over time. And yes, it would be great if we have Indigenous data. We're really poor at Indigenous data in the United States. And so we need to do better with that as well. They definitely, the Native population here tends to, Native American population, American Indian population tends to have some of the worst, if not the worst health outcomes. And certainly Native American men tend to have some of the worst health outcomes in our country. It's just that we don't, I don't want to get into too much of my own sort of politics and beliefs, but speaking for myself, we don't tend to prioritize their health. And so it is important that we can do better. A lot of it is about sampling, and sampling is a choice. How you decide to collect data and how you decide to collect information is a choice that we decide to make. You can invest in a way that would actually allow us to better capture the health of Native populations and Native men. We chose not to do that and choose generally not to do that. And so the point is we can do better, we just choose not to. Next slide. So the point here is, so what I basically was showing that within males, that the racial difference has grown within Black people, within Black Americans, within a racial group, that the sex difference has actually increased. So even though we tend to pay more attention to, and I very much do a lot of work that is focused primarily on racial and ethnic differences in the United States and globally, there's also this conflicting pattern of why are the sex differences growing over this period of time while we're actually seeing progress in the other way. And we're not paying attention to both. And actually part of the point here of bringing these together is the sex differences within group are tending to drive a lot of the differences that you actually see by race, meaning that there's a lot of papers that are talking about whether it's the famous paper from David Satcher, one of our Surgeon Generals, some other colleagues even before COVID that were showing, Ana Diaz-Rue and some others that were showing that it was basically Black men's health that was actually driving down the rates for Black Americans and increasing the gap between white and Black Americans, which is our usual primary sort of point of comparison, which we can talk about why that's a problem anyway. But that is just thinking about the groups, those are kind of issues that we're dealing with. Next slide. So when I brought these things up, this is a real story that came from, that was in the Washington Post. It was quoted in there about a year ago now. And, you know, this idea that men have a shorter life expectancy than women was something that I always assumed was something that was well known. And it was something that came as a surprise, apparently, to the American public. And so the author who wrote about this, the journalist who wrote about it, was actually the editor. And she was saying that she actually was trying to get one of her male colleagues to write about it. And he was saying he didn't want anything to do with this topic, not because he wasn't interested, but because he was afraid of the backlash that he would get by focusing on it. I, of course, was far more, I don't know if we'd call it naive or just willing to take a little backlash. And so my comment here that men are advantaged in every aspect of our society, yet have worse health outcomes for most things that will kill you, seemed to really upset a lot of people. And the good thing, as I was telling Matt, is I got hate mail or just, you know, nasty comments and awful, you know, reflections from pretty much everyone. So the good thing that I saw is my honesty was a unifying force in that it really does tend to I got people upset on the left for focusing on men's health. I got people upset on the right for focusing on just, it just was a really interesting sort of thing. And they got almost 1,000 comments in the chat, in their sort of response, which was a very unusual rate of people actually engaging with just a news article on a random day. Next slide. And so this response, this idea of, yes, men die younger, but we tend to have a very sort of okay, that is the way it is. Part of it is, I think, again, how we explain it, why we deal with it. But it's not something that has really garnered attention. The fact that men have this shorter life expectancy, have a higher rate of premature mortality, dying before the age of 60 or 70 than women. Again, pretty much in every country across the world, with the exception of probably 3 to 4. Next slide. And so she actually wrote a follow-up a couple days later, about 3 days later, and responded to the idea. This was that unusual that the author, the editor, the journalist felt like she needed to respond even more and just even say something to the fact that people were really offended by this idea that men are suffering, that men are living shorter lives, and that, you know, this idea of we shouldn't just accept it, was something that was really problematic for some. So part of the reason I'm starting at this point is because it is a striking thing that we don't see this as a priority, as a population, as a pattern that's really important. Now, again, this is something that ironically men are actually doing more, in many cases, than women. In this, what I mean by that is it's really male politicians, male leaders, male health professionals that don't tend to have an interest in men's health. So it's not, I'm not sort of saying, this is not where I'm trying to pit one against the other. It's actually men that I'm saying, why aren't we more interested in our own health? And that we don't actually pay attention to that. But it's also knowing that for some in the women's health, that this has been this attention, or my efforts and the effort of others to gain attention and support for men's health, has caused some issues and problems. Next slide. And so it is just going back to how do we explain this? A recent book by Richard Reeves talks about, you know, as we look at these patterns that, well, first of all, one of the things that was interesting in his book is that men aren't necessarily advantaged in certain, it depends on how you think about structural advantage. But if you're looking at where men are actually doing better in terms of, we're not doing better necessarily in terms of educational outcomes. We're not doing better in terms of employment and rates of unemployment and other, you know, other areas, I think 1 or 2 other areas. So the idea that it's sort of universal was something that some saw as really problematic, that I sort of made this more blanket statement, which to me was a reflection of, you know, basically more the politics, the history, the context, that we have to sort of think through. And yeah, this is where I'm sort of going with this, is where does patriarchy sort of fit into this picture? How do we sort of integrate these pieces? That's part of the problem, is how do we bring these conversations together? Next slide. And just to sort of highlight this as I get ready to close, this is not just, I showed it mostly US because I have most of the data from there, but as in my role as Global Action on Men's Health, we actually just did a report led by Drs. Natalie Leon and Christopher Colvin, I guess professors both, that basically showed this pattern of largely, again, men are dying at higher rates of cancer than women in basically most of the countries in the world. But when we talk about gender in that conversation, we don't tend to actually include men in those conversations. And particularly when men are doing worse, there's no real explanation, intention, discussion of those factors, and how do we actually deal with that? Next slide. And so just you know, basic things, just as an example, again, I want to get to discussion. So this is just a concrete example of where this idea was, that mortality rates from cancer were substantially higher among men than women, but you know, this wasn't really explained in a really thoughtful way or really addressed. And so how do we sort of have these conversations where we need to deal with that? Next slide. I think we're pretty much at the end. So where I'm going with this, to connect it back more explicitly to anti-racism, is that, and this is where I'm going to turn it back over to Matt. One of the things that we shared in our conversation, in our prep work, is that if we're going to be successful, we can't keep focusing on the problem. We have to figure out how we're going to envision, imagine, dream, and come up with concrete strategies and solutions for how we're going to address these issues. a lot of that is not just thinking about how do we look out at the work, and usually that's the way that we focused our attention, is what are the things we need to do differently. And in this context, we called it the outer work. It's actually a term that Kathleen Rowe, who's a professor, and now I'm blanking on the California school, that she put in a book on community organizing and so forth. But the point is that most of the work, when we think about these issues, organizing, anti-racism, men's health, and so forth, is really focused on the policies, the programs, how do we change those things, as opposed to what is the work you need to do to unlearn, relearn, learn more, and co-learn, learn with other people. What are those things you need to do in a way that is humble, respectful, in a way that shows your commitment to really these more sort of general values around equity, around equality, around fairness and justice. So let me turn it back over to Matt with that.
Whoa, I'm blown away again. I just want to take a minute to look at that compass. Take it in. Where did you go? What belief is being challenged for you? What thinking is being challenged? What feelings are coming up for you? And what does it make you want to do? You know, thinking for me, what happened to me just then, and it just happened right now. When Derek started talking about this oppositionality and this antagonistic between men's health and women's health, I remember a book I read by a man called Oba Shaka. He's an African-American academic, and he wrote a book called Return to the African Mother Principle of Male and Female Equality, 1995. But he actually spoke about in that book about how Western epistemology sees different as quite antagonistic and oppositional. And there are other ways, especially African and indigenous epistemology, that can see it more complementary. And that's what came up when I started to thinking about that. It's one thought that came up for me. Another one, in believing, what's really been challenged for me, and I'm going to be really honest with you, was the belief that's been challenged for me is, even though I have a huge amount of structural power as a cisgendered man, I don't need to feel guilty to think about my health. I'm not going to take anything away to talk about my health. So that's a belief that's been challenged for me, because I was probably one of those people, why are we talking about this? And actually, I look at these statistics almost all of the time. A belief that was fortified for me is that, outer work, changing policies, doing strategies is all necessary. But real transformation, systemic transformation, must also have something to do with who I am and the problem. The inner work I need to do to work out how I can be different in the health system, how I can be different in the education system. So that's been fortified. A lot of strong feelings have come up for me, and I'm wondering where you guys are at. Kat, you're in believing? Yep. I would love to interact with people now. One of the feelings that's come up for me is, I've never sort of spoken about this publicly, but I've got established heart disease, and I sit here with 2 stents inside me, so I am one of those cardiovascular statistics. I got them nearly 20 years ago. I'm 52. I got them at 32. I happened to be in Lebanon at the time when this happened, and this work with Derek has made me reflect on that moment of healthcare. And I just want to quickly relay it to you, because it was profound for me. I think that if I had been in New Zealand, I probably would have died. I was in Lebanon, and there's some accidents in this, but there's a universe coming together. I was running, and as I started to get these unusual chest pains, I actually I rang up a person from my village who was a cardiologist, who I knew as an elder, and we trusted each other like I knew him. So there was real trust in the relationship. I didn't have to suppress who I was. He also knew the health profile of not only our village, but my actual clan, the Whakari clan. Yeah, there was amazing things happening in this primary healthcare moment that I'd never experienced in New Zealand before. So he knew who I was. He knew my place and my name. He knew I was Mata Whakari. He also was able, and I think this is a cultural piece. Just go back to the slide before this, because I think this is the cultural humility piece, which is amazing to me. I've only reflected on it over the last week of working with Derek. There was a moment in which, as both he was taking care of me as an Arab, and I was responding to that, not only through the trust that I knew him as an elder in my village, but also a kind of camaraderie, a kind of way, a different kind of masculinity where he could speak into my anxieties, into possibly some of my masculinity of stubbornness, which was an interesting cultural specific moment. I believe from some of my experiences of my family who have passed away because they didn't get that kind of healthcare, they were put, oh, do you think it might be indigestion, come and see us, that I think it could have saved my life. And when I was reading this particular quote, and I looked at some of the things that we need in both the outer work and the inner work, it made me reflect on that. So yeah, after reflecting on that, I'm engaging from a much more personal place with Derek's work, and I can see myself in this. And I guess that's where is a good place to possibly hand over for some questions about where you're at. What's coming up for you? I can see there's some beautiful stuff going on in the chats.
And let me just add one other thing. I think one thing that I in writing about this recently, and actually most of those slides come from a paper that hopefully will be accepted sometime soon. It's been under review and in iterations for almost a year. But what struck me most was that slide that I showed that had the 15 leading causes of death being the same for men and women. And what I realized, and actually it was because of a reviewer, as much as I don't always appreciate the comments of reviewers, but it was a reviewer who said, you know, we could really, if we focused more on the fact that the 15 leading causes of death are the same for men and women, and we actually looked at how we would apply a gendered approach to that, that would actually advance us even further than if we try to do this men's health, women's health thing separately. And, you know, this is working with, and this is in the context of the work that I'm doing with the Office of Research on Women's Health within our National Institutes of Health, and thinking about how do we do that work. And so this hopefully will be part of that work and that issue, but it is part of that larger conversation that we're trying to have and trying to put together and put forward. We've done it in the context, I was very active in that work during COVID. We're doing more of it now, thinking about what does structural sexism and those kinds of things mean as it relates to this work and so forth. But I wanted to make sure that it's clear that I'm not just sort of throwing this out here and just beating the men's health drum. It is something that I'm trying to really think about. How do we bring these conversations together and integrate race into those pictures? Because the whole point, again, I didn't want to keep just, you know, presenting slides and data, you know, at you, but I wanted to make sure that we talked about, you know, bringing intersectionality into the conversation, that usually when we think about groups like Maori, when we're thinking about, you know, our native populations here and others, that we don't tend to look at a gendered lens as to what are the unique factors that need to be identified, mobilized, and actually the assets that we can build from within those groups and within those communities to strengthen those positions from where you are. So if gender and your ethnic, racial identity is part of who you are and important to you, how do we actually use that as a strength and an asset to build from, as opposed to, okay, let me find and pick apart your notions of masculinity that are problematic and correct those? Can we actually identify some strengths and assets in our communities in the way that we look at population groups, subgroups, and so forth, and have that be the foundation for where we're going with this? So let me go over to Mikey. Yeah.
I think that's brought up heaps, even just in the chat, but also in my own mind, because I'm thinking heaps about my frontline practice working in youth health, which, you know, we've had the Youth 19 survey results, which kind of show where things are at in terms of both ethnicity and gender disparity for things like mental health, suicidality, and top of the charts for suicide, for depression and anxiety is Maori young men. And it's up the gate, and a lot of the chat seems to be, and the questions that's in there is around the mental well-being and mental health for young men. As one of the things that I see is in my clinic, which is, I work in a youth health clinic in West Auckland and on the North Shore, about 70% of who we see are Maori or Pacifica young people, but only about 20% probably who come through the door are young men. And of those, almost all of them are brought in by women in their lives who are concerned about them, either for sexual health or mental health or all sorts of things. And what we definitely see is that our mental health services use not only, I mean, if you go to any therapy website and look at the available therapists, you will not see any Maori men faces as potential therapists. And how are young men, Maori men, meant to engage with someone when they can't even see themselves in the services that are out there? Do you know what I mean? Which reflects, you know, the nursing statistics of gender and ethnicity. Only about 9% are men, and a tiny portion of male nurses are Maori men in New Zealand. And increasingly, that's a similar statistic for GPs across the board. So the question Natasha's got in there is kind of around that. And it's like, how can we collectively uplift mental well-being of men, identifying as tangata whaiora, people seeking mental well-being, beyond the individual health approaches that aren't really working. So I don't know if that question sparks some thoughts for you, or I mean, I feel like I've got some thoughts on it working in the front lines of mental health and stuff, but yeah, do you have any thoughts around how we can shift that?
Can you read that out again quickly, Mikey?
Yeah, I mean, I think the question's really about the fact that our current models of mental health support don't work for men that well, and they definitely don't work for Maori men. In terms of, it's predominantly American models of psychological intervention implemented by clinicians who Maori men aren't relating to. How can we do better around that?
So I'm happy to start. I mean, I think from my end, one of the things, we have to sort of attack this as a multi-level problem. So one thing that I've thought about, and we did a project, actually funded by Movember, you know, next door to you all, that was called the Rooting Rising Collective, where basically my job was to create a mental well-being curriculum for young Black men, young in this case is 18 to 25, because they have the highest rates. Their rates of dying by suicide have increased markedly in the last decade or so. And so what we did was created this curriculum, but made it for social media influencers. So this were 10 young men in that age group who reflected those needs, who did a variety of arts, everything from comedy to drag shows to golf instruction. They yoga, they were kind of all over the place. But the point was that they were able to bring it into their art and basically share that with their audiences. They had a collective following, the 10 of them, of about 1.5 million people. And so the point is, you want to start to have conversations or do things where you're meeting people where they are, and have it into the natural conversation of those spaces and have that sort of filter down, while you're also working with people in their communities, in their families, to raise this sort of visibility. So you do have a modified version of my Fran Baum sort of nutcracker effect, where you have the grassroots growing and you have the efforts coming from policy, but you have these things that are coming at it from both ends. So I think we have to sort of figure out how you're going to build those sort of supports from both sides and do better. The idea that you're only going to, and as much as I agree with you, Mikey, about, we again have a similar pattern here of there are not enough Black men who are in these kind of roles and so forth, whether it's mental health, physical health, or so forth. The reality is you're never gonna, I mean, we can't wait until we have those. So we have to figure out, how do we equip everybody else to better serve these young men in this case. And again, I think not having a gendered approach is not about just men. I think if we had a gendered lens and actually did that for young women, I think that could actually potentially be even stronger and more effective too. So I'm not just saying this as, and this is why I'm saying they're more relational, thinking about how do we use a gendered lens that is actually going to be helpful to everyone could be, really important. And again, not forgetting my brothers and my folks who don't fit this gender binary, like that is a really important population to really center their experience, not of marginalization, but of community. And how do we actually think about, what does that mean for them and how that's an important part of who they are? Can we start from a strengths-based, assets-based standpoint to think about who those people are, what we need to think about, what is important to them as their foundation of who they are, and build out their strengths, build on their strengths as a way to build out their healthcare and particularly their mental health and well-being.
I'm real keen to have a chat about Heather's question that she sent through to us, which is how do we both smash patriarchy and care for men's health at the same time?
If we're asking me, I mean, I think we have to. Like, I think there's no choice. Like, patriarchy is not healthy for anybody. So it's like, if we're going to be successful in promoting men's health, we've got to sort of change how men think about what it means to be a man. Now, one of the things we know from our qualitative work, and done that some with a colleague or two in New Zealand, and some in even Australia and so forth, where we actually talk to men about how do they think about these issues. It's not just, again, we have to get away from, and that's not what Heather was implying or suggesting, but men don't necessarily buy into these hegemonic ideals. Really, they know they exist. But when you talk to men, we're not really trying to embody all of these things about toughness and all that kind of stuff, particularly when you get to adult men, of a certain age. When you get into those middle age and older years, you're actually more trying to figure out how do we think about what it means to, again, it's more the adulting side of things, in a very my very technical word, made up word here. But it's thinking about when you're an adult, you put your children's, health over yours. You put your efforts to care for them, provide for them, support them in whatever way. You put love far above your own individual health. And we hate to, again, recognize that that is what men are doing. And some of the reasons that they may be dying, again, it's not something that is unique to men. I mean, mothers, do it equally or even more so. Than they have the second shift of work and effort a lot of times in homes. So again, not trying to say this is, again, trying to get away from the competition to more say the gendered lens is a really important thing to do. But we can't sort of lean into the patriarchal ideas and think that is going to be helpful in those conversations. Notions of manhood are really about what it means to be an adult man, and that get away often from these basic ideas that really do lean into the relational side of things and how you're trying to be a better asset to your family, your community, and so forth.
Can I just add something here? Something's come up very interestingly in the chat after Heather's question. How can we smash patriarchy without focusing on men's mental and physical health? I just love that challenge there, right? In the sense that how do you begin to smash patriarchy? Well, as a cisgendered male, white presenting Arab, I first got to work out what my story around patriarchy is. See, what's agitating me here is we know the problem. We also know the problem of a lack of racial and ethnic diversity in the workforce, right? And there isn't just a one-off solution, a one and done. I mean, if someone's got the playbook, please, let's do it. So the outer work is interesting, and it comes to this idea of my own association with patriarchy and with whiteness and with whatever other power system and sexuality and diverse genders and sexualities. First, I need to be able to work out what my story is around that. And in what ways, as a cisgendered male, do I practice misogyny as I walk through the world and may even be unaware of it? What's then your story if you have a different experience from me? And how do we actually hold that space? Because it gets really tough, right? And then how does our story emerge in the middle, which is not a place of utopia, but quite a sticky, messy, difficult place to navigate? But I don't see these conversations happening a lot in the systems I work in. There's a lot of problem definition and evaluation, which is important. But there's a real lack of who am I in this, because it's actually more comfortable to separate yourself out from it and say, oh, there goes the patriarchy's over there and the bad misogynists are also over there. Whereas really, it's a harder question to ask, in what ways do I perpetuate? I'm thinking about myself here. I'm not preaching to anyone else out there, because there's plenty of ways that I perpetuate. Sometimes I interrupt, I hope, perpetuate these systems of power that are inside us, outside of us. We tend to be more comfortable. I tend to be more comfortable talking about this outside of myself, just to challenge out there and just a bit of a chat.
There's one
Right.
question, and talk about this one question, partly because it's real interesting looking at the attendees' names on this list and noticing that there's definitely not the majority men in the room at the moment. It's a much smaller number. But Graham's asked a question about what experience do you have of the efficacy of men's circles and rites of passage ceremonies for young men? And before I pass it on to you two, at my workplace, we have a young dads group for young dads aged 13 to 25. That's a facilitated group, and it's produced some amazing outcomes of getting these young dads together to talk about the unique challenges they have, partly of like navigating their masculinities and navigating, the models of fatherhood that they've received before them. And it's a real interesting kind of support. And what comes out of that is just some of the most nurturing young men that I've come across. And in Tamaki, a while back, I haven't been involved too much lately, but we had set up a left-wing men's group that was about providing the space for men to kind of tackle with and deconstruct the toxic masculine traits that they might have picked up, and tried to work on nurturing and encouraging that positive masculinity, nurturing masculinity. Do you two of you have any comments on men's circles or your involvements with them?
Yes. So in my work, when we do more of the behavioral community-based intervention, there always is a group component, because most of if you think about masculinities and the ways that people, it's a social construct. It's something you reinforce by how you interact with others, or what you're trying to portray and what you're trying to communicate, and what kinds of things you're trying to deal with in the hierarchy of gender, and how men are sort of operating in that space. So if you're going to disrupt it, you got to actually do it in community with others. And so helping men to actually find, one, they're not alone in struggling with these issues, but actually what are some things that other men are doing that help them, that help to undo those messages, undo those kind of lessons and learnings, and figure out how they're going to try to be who they're trying to actually called to be. So yes, men's sheds, men's groups, men's other things have definitely shown a lot of success and promise. Rites of passage definitely are things that, as I understand it, I've not been as directly involved with those, or actually with sheds either. I just know they're very effective, and I have other types of interventions that tend to be small group based and so forth. So that's more where I'm talking from. Rites of passage, as I've sort of looked at the literature, has really been more of an anchor into the cultural, ethnic, racial side of things, and really trying to help men develop, sort of connect to that side of their work, their identity and their work and so forth. They can be, they usually are not terribly critical of the way they think about masculinity. So I would just be cautious. My only caution is they tend to be really strong about, but they can be something that tends to sort of reinforce a very traditional patriarchal sort of relationship between men and women. So that would be my only caution about what I've seen of rites of passage programs, that is trying to basically reinstate, that the goal for young men is to try to basically reassert or to, that they're trying to grow back into this leadership role in the family and so forth. And that's kind of what we're trying to move away from, this monolithic 1950s model of what it means to be grown in a man.
Look, thank you. I guess I've got so much to say here about this, but I'll just be really brief. Number one, most of the people that cancel our work are men, yeah, and most of them are white men when we're talking about anti-racism. And I believe this is because, okay, if I know my story, that's a challenge enough. If I have to hear Derek's story, or Mikey's story, there's some challenge in that because I have to deal with my own foolishness about, oh, this is not the way we all are. But then actually speaking to power, and I think that speaking truth to power or transformation around power is where the challenge lies, especially in systems where people fear this, where people's jobs rely on it. And so not so much those groups as people coming along, but in our work, that becomes the greatest challenge and where the work gets very, very difficult. And then when I'm presented with Derek's research, I'm thinking, why do you want to maintain a system that's not even benefiting you health-wise, you know, which is fascinating, right? And so this idea of how do we move the conversation to where it needs to get to become more critical, you know, of power as it plays out. And that's the hardest place to go. And, you know, we'll go into rooms to do our work and there'll be no men present at all. And we make a joke saying, well, I guess men don't need this conversation, but you know, I see here that you've written, if we overthrow capitalism, will that help men's health? I think that this is part of this conversation too. Like it's, we live in as Bell Hooks would say, a white supremacist capitalist patriarchy. I mean, where do you stop and start? None of them, these systems support each other. People who are misogynistic are very able to be heteronormative, gender normative, and racist. So there's an interconnection. My only offering there is, how do we begin to hold the conversation long enough to actually address how power is playing across this? And that's where it gets challenging in the systems I work in. Thank you.
Yeah, and just really quickly, I know we're getting ready to close, but yeah, Leah's question, and just finally catching up in the chat here. No, I'm definitely not talking only about white men. That's, I think, why the point was I was making about these things that we've tried to change, and how, particularly in my work, Black men see themselves, how I work with Latino men and somebody who's leading that work to take these kinds of lessons and apply those in those spaces. I worked with Dr. Warwick at Auckland Institute of Technology around some of his work with Maori men. So it's not suggesting at all that this is something unique to or only about white men. This is not again, useless for me to sort of go in and try to attack white men like that's going to solve the problem. We have to sort of start from strength. We have to start from assets. We've got to figure out what are the things that are shared that we're actually trying to promote, not how are we trying to oppress others.
Totally support. I mean, this is the thing that keeps people away from our work, because they feel like they're going to become the target. And actually, if white cisgendered males and whatever classification you want to do can actually engage in this and want to build a different world, then the system changes, right? Because there's certain structural power. And so including everyone in this conversation, to me, is the key, and finding a way to do that is the challenge. Sorry.
And one last 2 seconds. We are actually working with a colleague who studies whiteness in the US, and really one of the next steps is really going to be, how do you center what a white male identity really looks like, as opposed to one that just focuses on gender. We actually need to look at whiteness as a racial construct too. So stay tuned.
Thank you both, Derek and Matt, for that. I had so many goosebumps throughout listening to the two of you talk, and I think it's such a vital and important inclusion in this conference. And apologies to the questions that we didn't get to. We're just short on time. But thank you both so much. Hey? Thank you.
Thank you so much.
And yeah, just a big thank you to the partners that made this conference possible. I'm really glad to count my union there, the New Zealand Nurses Organization, as one of the ones there. And just a cheeky note, if you help to the lobby, you'll see a post from me in the lobby chat about the new Stop Institutional Racism t-shirts. They're really cool. You should buy one, and there's a link to buy one. Sorry for that little cheeky inclusion there, but real important. Just a heads up as well, on Friday we have the Pecha Kucha, which is a 5-hour marathon of short interactive talks from students and recent graduates on the research that they're doing. So 18 quick-fire presentations, break rooms to chat with the speakers. It'll be awesome. But I'll just close with karakia, and then we'll head up. Ka whakarai, te tapu, kia wātia ai te ara, kia turuki whakataha ai, kia turuki whakataha ai, homie, huie, haidie. Thank you all for joining us.